Oh, I don't like this version. Okay, are we on? I think we are. Good. Let me get the other thing. So, this is new, a new thing. I am going to, and I started doing it already. I have a YouTube channel, and once I figure out how to put more videos up. Why is this jumping? I don't like it. I'm ending this and starting again. No, I'm not. I'm going to leave it. Anyway, the I'm going to upload these videos onto the YouTube channel, which I've already uploaded most of them. Look at my hair. I look like a crazy person. And then I'm going to stream live on YouTube when I read the next book, because I think that that is going to be better. I'll make that quiet. And then you don't have to be a Facebook friend to watch the video. You could just watch it on YouTube, and as long as you have the link. And so I'm going to handle that tonight. And there's nobody on this thing. Nobody. Nobody loves me. Where is everyone? You don't want to hear the end of the book? What's wrong with you? So, I don't know why I brought food to eat. Look, I made little pound cakes. It's delicious. Anyway, I'm wondering if I shouldn't just read the next book. Well, not the next book, because the next book is, what is the next book? I think it's Prince Caspian. No, The Horse and His Boy. Don't like that one really, hardly at all. Prince Caspian is an okay book, but The Voyage of the Dawn Treader is my next favorite of these 7. So we'll see. But anyway, where am I? Chapter 16 is where we are. Is anybody here? Nobody's even here yet. Arlette is there. Okay, so chapter 16. What happened about the statues? If you remember, the Lucy and Susan and Aslan just jumped over the fence into the witch's castle's yard. What an extraordinary place, cried Lucy. All those stone animals and people, too. It's like a museum. Hush, said Susan. Aslan's doing something. He was indeed. He had bounded up to the stone lion and breathed on him. Then, without waiting a moment, he whisked around, almost as if he had been a cat chasing his tail, and breathed on a stone dwarf, which, as you remember, was standing a few feet from the lion with his back to it. Then he pounced on a tall stone dryad, which stood beyond the dwarf, and rapidly turned aside to deal with the stone rabbit on his right, and he rushed on to 2 centaurs. But at that moment, Lucy said, "Oh, Susan, look at the lion." I expect you've seen someone put a lighted match to a bit of newspaper which is propped up in a grate against an unlit fire, and for a second nothing seems to have happened. And then you notice a tiny streak of flame creeping across the edge of the newspaper. It was like that now. For a second after Aslan breathed upon him, the stone lion looked just the same. Then a tiny streak of gold began to run along his white marble back, and then it spread. Then the color seemed to lick all over him as the flame licks over a piece of paper. Then, while his hindquarters were still obviously stone, The lion shook his mane, and all the heavy stone folds rippled into living hair. Then he opened his great red mouth, warm and living, and gave a prodigious yawn. Then he opened a and now his hind legs had come to life. He lifted one of them and scratched himself. Then, having caught sight of Aslan, went bounding after him and frisked around him, whimpering with delight and jumping up to lick his face. Of course, the children's eyes turned to follow the lion, but the sight they saw was so wonderful that they soon forgot about him. Everywhere, statues were coming to life. The courtyard looked no longer like a museum, it looked more like a zoo. Creatures were running after Aslan and dancing around him till he was almost hidden in the crowd. Instead of all that deadly white, the courtyard was now a blaze of colors: glossy chestnut sides of centaurs, indigo horns of unicorns, dazzling plumage of birds, reddy brown of foxes, dogs, and satyrs, yellow stockings and crimson hoods of dwarfs, and the birch girls in silver, and the beech girls in fresh transparent green, and the lark girls in green so bright that it was almost yellow. And instead of the deadly science, the whole place rang with the happy roarings and brayings, yelpings, barkings, squealings, cooings, neighings, stampings, shouts, hurrahs, and songs and laughter. "Oh," said Susan in a different tone, "look! Is it safe?" Lucy looked and saw that Aslan had just breathed on the feet of a stone giant. "It's all right," shouted Aslan. "Once the feet are put right, all the rest of him will follow." "That wasn't exactly what I meant," whispered Susan to Lucy. But it was too late to do anything about it now. Even if Aslan would have listened to her, the change was already creeping up the giant's legs, and now he was moving his feet. A moment later, he lifted his club off his shoulder and rubbed his eyes and said, "Bless me, I must have been asleep. Now, where's that dratted little witch that was running about on the ground? Somewhere just by my feet it was." And then everyone shouted up to him to explain what had really happened. And when the giant put his hand to his ear and got them to repeat it all again so that he could understand, then he plowed down his head until no further off than the top of a haystack and touched his cap repeatedly to Aslan, beaming all over his giant, ugly face. Giants are of any sort are now so rare in England, and so few giants are good tempered that 10 to 1 you've never seen a giant when his face was beaming. So this was a sight well worth looking at. "Now for inside the house," said Aslan. "Look alive, everyone, upstairs and downstairs, and in my lady's chambers. Leave no corner unsearched. You never know what poor prisoner may be concealed." And into the interior they all rushed, and for several minutes the whole of that dark, horrible, fusty old castle echoed with the opening of windows and everyone's voices crying out at once, "Don't forget the dungeons! Give us a hand with the door! Here's another winding stair! Oh, say, here's a poor kangaroo! Call Aslan! Whew, it smells in here! Look out for trap doors! Up here, there's a whole lot more on the landing!" And the best of all was when Lucy came rushing, shouting, "Aslan, I've found Mr. Tumnus! Oh, come quick!" A moment later, Lucy and the little fawn were holding each other by both hands and dancing around for joy. The little chap was no worse for the wear for having been a statue, and of course was very interested in all that she had to tell him. But at last the ransacking of the witch's fortress was ended, and the whole castle stood empty with every door and window open, and the light and the sweet spring air flooding in all the dark and evil places which needed them so badly. The whole crowd of liberated statues surged back into the courtyard, and then someone, Tumnus, I think, first said, "But how are we going to get out?" For Aslan had got in by a jump, and the gates were still locked. "It'll be all right," said Aslan. Then rising up on his hind legs, he yelled to the giant, "Yo, you up there! What's your name?" "Giant Rumblebuffin, if you please," said the giant. "Well then, Giant Rumblebuffin, just let us out of this, will you?" "Certainly, your honor, it will be my pleasure," said Giant Rumblebuffin. "Stand well away from the gates, all you little uns." And he strode to the gate himself, and bang, bang, bang went his huge club, and the gates creaked cracked at the second, and shivered at the third, and then he tackled the towers on each side of them, and after a few minutes of crashing and thudding, both the towers and a good bit of the wall on each side went thundering down in a mass of hopeless rubble. And when the dust was cleared, it was odd, standing in that dry, grim, stony yard, to see through the gap at all the grass and waving trees and sparkling streams. "Blowed if it ain't all in a muck sweat," said the giant, puffing up like a railway engine. Comes from being out of condition. I suppose neither of you young ladies has such a thing as a pocket handkerchief, do you?" "Yes, I have," said Lucy, standing on tiptoe and holding her handkerchief as far up as she could reach. "Thank you, Missy," said Giant Rumblebuffin, stooping down. The next moment Lucy got a rather fright, for she caught herself in the mid-air between the giant's finger and thumb, and just as she was getting near his face, he startled and gently put her back on the ground. "Bless me, I've picked up the little girl instead. I beg your pardon, miss, but I thought you were the handkerchief." "Oh, no," said Lucy, "here it is." And this time he managed to get it, but it was only about the same size to him as a saccharin tablet would be to you. So when she saw him solemnly rubbing it to and fro across his giant face, she said, "I'm afraid it's not much use to you, Mr. Rumblebuffin." "Not at all, not at all. I never met a nicer handkerchief. It's so fine and so handy. I just don't know how to describe it." "What a nice giant he is," Lucy said to Mr. Tumnus. "Oh, yes," said the fawn. "All the Buffins always were. One of the most respected of all the giant families in Narnia. Not very clever, perhaps. I never knew a giant who was. But an old family with traditions, you know. And if he'd been of the other sort, she never would have turned him to stone." At this point, Aslan clapped his paws together and called for silence. "Our day's work is not over yet," he said, "and with the witch is to finally be defeated before bedtime, we must find the battle at once." "And join in, I hope, sir," added the largest of the centaurs. "Of course," said Aslan. "And now, those who can't keep up, that is, children, dwarfs, and small animals, must ride on the backs of those who can, that is, lions, centaurs, unicorns, horses, giants, and eagles. Those of you who are good with your noses must come in the front with us lions to smell out where the battle is. Look lively and sort yourselves." And with a great deal of bustle and cheering they did. The most pleased of the lot was the other lion, who kept running about everywhere, pretending to be very busy, but really in order to say to everyone he met, "Did you hear what he said? Us lions. That means me and him. Us lions. That's what I like about Aslan. No side, no standoffishness. Us lions." That meant him and me. At least he went on saying that until Aslan loaded him up with 3 dwarves, 1 dryad, 2 rabbits, and a hedgehog. That steadied him a bit. When all were ready, it was a big sheepdog who actually helped Aslan most in getting them sorted into their proper order. They set out through the gap in the castle wall. At first, the lions and dogs went nosing about in all directions, and suddenly one great hound picked up the scent and gave a bay. There was no time lost after that. All the dogs and lions and wolves and other hunting animals were going at full speed with their noses to the ground. All the others streaked out for about a half a mile between them and were following as fast as they could. The noise was like an English fox hunt, only better, because every now and then with the music of the hounds was mixed the roar of the other lion, and sometimes far deeper and more awful roar of Aslan himself. Faster and faster they went as the scent became easier and easier to follow. And then, just as they came to the last curve in a narrow, winding valley, Lucy heard above all these things another noise, a different one, which gave her a queer feeling inside. It was a noise of shouts and shrieks and the clashing of metal against metal. Then they came out of the narrow valley, and at once she saw the reason. There stood Peter and Edmund and all the rest of Aslan's army, fighting desperately against a crowd of horrible creatures whom she had seen last night. Only now, in the daylight, they looked even more strange and more evil and more deformed. There also seemed to be far more of them. Peter's army, which had their backs to her, looked terribly few, and there were statues dotted all over the battlefield, so apparently the witch had been using her wand. But she did not seem to be using it now. She was fighting with her stone knife. It was Peter she was fighting, both of them going at it so hard that Lucy could hardly make out what was happening. She only saw the stone knife and Peter's sword flashing so quickly that they looked like three knives and three swords. The pair were in the center, and on each side the line stretched out. Horrible things were happening wherever she went. "Off my back, children," shouted Aslan, and they both tumbled off. With a roar that shook all of Narnia from the western lamppost to the shores of the eastern sea, the great beast flung himself upon the White Witch. Lucy saw her face lifted up toward him for 1 second with an expression of terror and amazement. Then lion and witch rolled over together, but with the witch underneath, and at the same time all the warlike creatures whom Aslan had led from the witch's house rushed madly on the enemy lines. Dwarves with their battle axes, dogs with teeth, and the giant with his club, and his feet also crushed dozens of foes. Unicorns with their horns, and centaurs with swords and hooves. And Peter's tired army cheered, and the newcomers roared, and the enemy squealed and gibbered until the wood re-echoed with the din of that onset. Chapter 17. Hold on. This is it. This is the last chapter. My goodness. The battle was all over in a few minutes after their arrival. That was a hard sentence to read. Most of the enemy had been killed in the first charge of Aslan and his companions, and when those who were still living saw that the witch was dead, they either gave themselves up or took flight. The next thing that Lucy knew was that Peter and Aslan were shaking hands. It was strange to her to see Peter looking as he looked now. His face was so pale and stern, and he seemed so much older. "It was all Edmund's doing, Aslan," Peter was saying. "We'd have been beaten if it hadn't been for him. The witch was turning our troops into a stone left and right, but nothing would stop him. He fought his way through 3 ogres to where she was turning one of your leopards into a statue. And when he reached her, he had the sense to bring his sword smashing down on her wand instead of trying to go for her directly, and simply getting made into a statue himself for his pains. That was the mistake all the rest were making. Once her wand was broken, we began to have a chance. If we hadn't lost so many, he was terribly wounded, and we must go see to him." Hold on. Bone's gonna die. Okay. They found Edmund in the charge of Mrs. Beaver, a little way back from the fighting line. He was covered in blood. His mouth was open, and his face was a nasty green color. "Quick, Lucy," said Aslan. And then, almost for the first time, Lucy remembered the precious cordial that had been given to her for a Christmas present. Her hands trembled so much that she could hardly undo the stopper, and she managed it in the end and poured a few drops into her brother's mouth. "There are other people wounded," said Aslan, while she stood eagerly looking into Edmund's pale face and wondering if it had any result. "Yes, I know," said Lucy crossly. "Wait a minute." "Daughter of Eve," said Aslan in a grave voice. "Others also are at the point of death. Must more people die for Edmund?" "I'm sorry, Aslan," said Lucy, getting up and going with him. And for the next half hour they were busy, she attending to the wounded while he restored those who had been turned to stone. And when at last she was free to come back to Edmund, she found him standing on his feet and not only healed of his wounds, but looking better than she had seen him look for, ages. In fact, ever since his first term at that horrid school where he had begun to go so very wrong. He had become his real old self again and could look you in the face. And there on the battlefield, Aslan made him a knight. "Does she know," whispered Lucy to Susan, "what Aslan did for him? Does he know what the arrangement with the White Witch really was?" "Hush, of course not," said Susan. "Oughtn't he be told?" said Lucy. "Oh, surely not," said Susan. "It would be too awful for him. Think how you'd feel if it were the same." "All the same, I think he ought to know," said Lucy. But at that moment they were interrupted. They slept that night where they were. How Aslan provided food for them all, I don't know. But somehow or another they found themselves all sitting on the grass, to a fine high tea at about 8 o'clock. The next day they began marching eastward down the side of the great river, and the next day after that, at about tea time, they actually reached the mouth. The castle of Cair Paravel on its little hill towered above them. Before them were sands with rocks and little pools of salt water and seaweed and the smell of the sea, and long miles of bluish green waves breaking for ever and ever on the beach. And oh, the cry of the seagulls! Have you ever heard it? Can you remember it? That evening after tea, the four children all managed to get down to the beach again and get their shoes and stockings off and feel the sand between their toes. But the next day was much more solemn. For there in the great hall of Cair Paravel, that wonderful hall with the ivory roof and the west wall hung with peacock feathers, and the eastern door which looks towards the sea, and in the presence of all of their friends, and to the sounds of trumpets, Aslan solemnly crowned them and led them to the four thrones amid deafening shouts of "Long live King Peter! Long live Queen Susan! Long live King Edmund! Long live Queen Lucy!" Once a king or queen in Narnia, always a king or queen. "Bear it well, sons of Adam, bear it well, daughters of Eve," said Aslan. And through the eastern door, which was wide open, came the voices of the mermen and the mermaids swimming close to the shore, singing in honor of the new kings and queens. So the children sat on their thrones, and scepters were put into their hands, and they gave rewards and honors to all their friends, to Tumnus the fawn, to the beavers, and giant Rumblebuffin, and to the leopards, and to the good centaurs, and the good dwarfs, and to the lion. And that night there was a great feast in Cair Paravel, and revelry and dancing, and gold flashed and wine flowed, and answering the music inside, but sweeter and stranger and more piercing, came the music of the sea people. But amidst all these rejoicings, Aslan himself quietly slipped away, and when the kings and queens noticed that he wasn't there, they said nothing about it, for Mr. Beaver had warned them. "He'll be coming and going," he said. "One day you'll see him, and another you won't. He doesn't like being tied down, and of course he has other countries to attend to. It's quite all right. He'll often drop in, only you mustn't press him. He's wild, you know, not like a tame lion." And now you see this story is nearly, but not quite, at an end. These two kings and two queens governed Narnia well, and long and happy was their reign. At first, much of their time was spent seeking out the remnants of the White Witch's army and destroying them. And indeed, for a long time, there would be news of evil things lurking in the wilder parts of the forest, a haunting here, a killing there, a glimpse of a werewolf of 1 month, and the rumor of a hag the next. But in the end, all that foul brood was stamped out, and they made good laws, and kept the peace, and saved good trees from being unnecessarily cut down, and liberated young dwarfs and young satyrs from being sent to school, and generally stopped busybodies and interferers, and encouraged ordinary people who wanted to live and let live. And they drove back the fierce giants, quite a different sort from giant Rumblebuffin, good God, in the north of Narnia, where these ventured across the border, and they entered into friendship and alliance with countries beyond the sea, and paid them visits of state, and received visits of state from them. And they themselves grew and changed as the years passed over them, and Peter became a tall, deep-chested man and a great warrior, and he was called King Peter the Magnificent. And Susan grew into a tall and gracious woman with black hair that fell almost to her knees, and the kings of the countries beyond the sea began to send ambassadors asking for her hand in marriage. She was called Queen Susan the Gentle. Edmund was a graver and quieter man than Peter, and great in counsel and judgment. He was called King Edmund the Just. But as for Lucy, she was always gay and golden haired, and all the princes in the parts desired to have her be their queen, and all the people called her Queen Lucy the Valiant. So they lived in great joy, and if ever they remembered their life in this world, it was only as one remembers a dream. And one year it fell out that Tumnus, who was a middle-aged fawn by now, and beginning to be stout, came down river and brought them news that the white stag had once more appeared in his parts. The white stag who would give you wishes if you caught him. So these 2 kings and 2 queens, with the principal members of their court, rode a hunting with horns and hounds in the western woods to follow the white stag. They had not hunted long before they had a sight of him, and he led them a great pace over rough and smooth and through thick and thin, till the horses of all the courtiers were tired out, and these 4 were still following. And they saw the stag enter into a thicket where their horses could not follow. And then said King Peter, for they talked in quite a different style now, having been kings and queens for so long, fair consorts, let us now alight from our horses and follow this beast into the thicket, for in all my days I never hunted a nobler quarry. Sir, said the others, even so let us do. So they alighted and tied their horses to trees and went on to the thick wood on foot. And as soon as they entered it, Queen Susan says, fair friends, here is a great marvel, for I seem to see a tree of iron. Madam, said King Edmund, if you look well upon it, you shall see it is a pillar of iron with a lantern set atop thereof. By the Queen's mane, a strange device, said King Peter, to set a lantern here with the trees cluster so thick about it and so high above it, that if it were lit, it should give light to no man. Sir, said Queen Lucy, by likelihood, when this post and this lamp were set here, there were smaller trees in the place, or fewer, or none. For this is a young wood, and this iron post is old. And they stood looking upon it. And then King Edmund said, I know not how it is, but this lamp on the post worketh upon me strangely. It runs in my mind that I have seen it like before, as it were in a dream, or in the dream of a dream. Sir, answered they all, it is even so with us. And more, said Queen Lucy, for it will not go out of my mind that if we pass this post and lantern, either we shall find strange adventures or some great change to our fortunes. Madam, said King Edmund, the like foreboding stirreth in my heart. And in mine, fair brother, said King Peter. Get down. And in mine also, said Queen Susan. Wherefore, be my counsel, we shall lightly return to our horses and follow the white stag no further. Madam, said King Peter, therein I pray thee to have me excused. For never since we 4 kings and queens in Narnia have we set our hands to any high matter, as battles, quests, feats of arms, acts of justice, and the like, and then given over, but always what we have taken in hand, and the same we have achieved. Sister, said Queen Lucy, my royal brother speaks rightly. It seems to me that we should be shamed, if not for fearing or foreboding, we turned back from following so noble a beast as we now have in chase. And so say I, said King Edmund, and I have such desire to find the significance of this thing, that I would not by my good will turn back for the richest jewels in Narnia and all the islands. Then in the name of Aslan, said Queen Susan, if ye will all have it so, then let us go and take the adventure that shall fall to us. So these kings and queens of Narnia entered the thicket, and before they had gone a score of paces, they all remembered that the thing they had seen was called a lamp post. And before they had gone 20 more, they noticed that they were making their way not through branches, but through coats. And the next moment they all came tumbling out of the wardrobe into an empty room. And there were no longer kings and queens in their hunting array, just Peter, Susan, Edmund, and Lucy in their old clothes. It was the same day and the same hour of the day on which they had all gone into the wardrobe to hide. Mrs. Macready and the visitors were still talking in the passage, but luckily they never came into the empty room, so the children were not caught. And that would have been the very end of the story if it hadn't been that they felt they really must explain to the professor why 4 of the coats out of his wardrobe were missing. And the professor, who was a very remarkable man, didn't tell them not to be silly or not to tell lies, but believed the whole story. No, he said, I don't think it will be any good trying to go back through the wardrobe to get the coats. You won't get into Narnia again by that route. Nor would the coats be much use by now if you did. What's that? Yes, of course you'll be back to Narnia someday. Once a king in Narnia, always a king in Narnia. But don't go trying to use the same route twice. Indeed, don't try to get there at all. It'll happen when you're not looking for it. And don't talk too much about it, even among yourselves. And don't mention it to anyone unless you find that they've had adventures of the same sort themselves. What's that? How will you know? Oh, you'll know all right. Odd things, they say, even their looks will let the secret out. Keep your eyes open. Bless me, what do they teach you at these schools? And then, in the very end of the adventure of the wardrobe, and that is the very end of the adventure of the wardrobe. But if the professor was right, it was only the beginning of the adventures of Narnia. Ta-da! That's it. That's the end of the book. And it doesn't look like anybody ever came into this live thing. So that makes me sad, clown. Um, so I will say again, for anybody who isn't listening, just in case you listen later, I am going to upload all of these videos, there's 5 of them, onto the YouTube channel. And I will post a link to the YouTube channel once I get it all functioning and working properly. I have 3 of them loaded, and I'll load the last 2 tonight. And then if you have an idea of what book you want me to read, I have a lot of books at school and I could go there and get some. Or I could read The Voyage of the Dawn Treader. What say you, children? Hmm? Hmm? All right. So I don't know if you heard, the state superintendent and the state school board closed school for the rest of the year, but there will be something called distance learning. Nobody knows what that is. But we will try to figure it out. And that is all. I hope you are safe. I hope you are well. If you need anything, call me. Love your faces. See you tomorrow. If I don't hear from you, I'm just going to pick a book myself. I can get any book from the library on my iPad, so. All right? Mwah. Goodbye.